It's always wonderful to be back. This is my home church. I was dedicated as a baby in this church, been around a while. I want to just give you a few words of endorsement for your new lead pastor, John Lane. I've known him for a long time. When I worked at International Child Care Ministries, I went to his church in Bedford, Indiana a couple times because that's a church that really has invested largely in the children of the world. It's also a church that loves Haiti, almost as much as this one. I know there are a lot of you who have gone on mission trips to Haiti. And then when he was the superintendent and I was still at ICCM, we partnered together for children's sponsorship in Bangladesh. And I met up with John Lane in India when he was on his way to Bangladesh and the leadership that he's done there. So he has a passion for the kingdom of God, for the global mission of the church, and locally. One last thing I have to tell you. As a bishop, I get dozens of what you think of as junk emails every day, like from conference superintendents and other people who send out a weekly thing. And he's not even in my region, so I didn't have to read his. A lot of those weekly things that came from superintendents, I just like click by click by click. I always read his, because it is profound. It is rich theologically and practically. It only takes 4 or 5 minutes to read it, but it impacts my life. So I know that you are in for an incredible treat when he becomes your next lead pastor. So it was actually on Pastor Kay, before she was Bishop Kay, she had a preaching plan that included 4 sermons from the book of Ruth right now. And then when she was elected, she asked me if I would do it. And I said, sure, but I knew that I had only preached 1 sermon in a regular church setting on the book of Ruth, but it wasn't very regular because it was in the north of Iraq. It was in Kurdistan, and almost everybody in the congregation was a refugee from Baghdad. And I just had to go to this book of the Bible because it is so full of the stories of people being forced out of their homes against their will, and then the providence of God in it. Now, you notice that I named this series Providence in Pain. Now, a lot of times people think of the book of Ruth. I mean, it's a tiny little book. It's 4 chapters. The narrator on my Bible app can read it in 13 minutes. So, like this afternoon, you could sit down and read it. Or tomorrow morning, you could start the coffee, sit down and read it before your first cup. That's how short the book is. And it's been thought of as a kind of like human interest story, a little lightweight thing tucked in there between all the gory junk in Judges and then 1 Samuel. But it's really not, and it's not a Cinderella story. It's not about a damsel in distress with a knight in shining armor who comes to rescue her poor self. No, it's a little more than that. It's a lot more than that. So I said Providence in Pain because I want us to look at the story as it asks to be looked at. So sometimes people think that we have to airbrush God, like that we can't really talk about the hard stuff. I just noticed, I love the song we just sang. I've been singing it nonstop for a couple of months. It says, with every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. You're going to see a few moments in this story when they just are not able. They can't sing about God's goodness. They're singing about something else. They're brokenhearted. And this is a story that doesn't gloss over the pain. Would it be refreshing to you to know that there's not a page in the Bible that doesn't acknowledge human suffering? That's what John W. Peterson said, and he's the one who translated the Message. So he knows every word in the Bible. He said there's not a page that glosses over human suffering. So this first series, this episode 1, is called Just When You Think It Can't Get Worse. Now, I've been to Haiti 15 times, and I would say this is a mantra for the country of Haiti. But if you lived in Israel the last couple of days, and there were bombs coming at you, and if you were in the West Bank, if you were in Palestine, you would think the same. It just gets worse. And the politics in our country, to say nothing of your own personal life, because the truth is, unimaginably bad things have happened to many of you. And those things throw us for a loop. We don't even know what to do when life turns out that way. let's begin with the text itself, Ruth 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Okay, it just mentions that this happened in the time of the judges. So what you know is that's very early in salvation history, and Ruth is a kind of hinge book between the first huge chapter of God's work with his covenant people and then the next chapter. So you've got, remember, did you learn the Pentateuch? Okay, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. So you stop right there and tuck Ruth in as a hinge. Then you get to 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. You're going to get on to the kingdom and David and all that. But this is like the backstory. Do any of you read novels by people like James Michener? Like, he likes to back up to prehistoric times to tell you about what happened, who was there before the current inhabitants of the land, whether that's South Africa or Hawaii or Alaska. He loves to back up. Now, some of us are impatient with that 200 pages, and we just want to get up to like what's going on now. But this is a kind of prequel. I had a weird experience one day. I'm driving up north in Michigan, and I stop at a cemetery in Shepherd, Michigan. Anybody heard of that little town? There's a 16-year-old girl buried there who's my great-grandma. Now, is that a weird feeling to see this name on a headstone and know that this girl, I look at her dates, she was 16 years old. She was married at the time, and she died in childbirth when my grandma was born. And then my grandma's father didn't think he could raise her by himself, so he adopted her out to the people that my mom knew as her grandparents, right? This is the story of the great-grandma of King David. And this is giving us the backstory because it's very significant. It's not just any old story. Now let's talk a little bit more about this chaos. The chaos that happened in the book of Judges was because people were turning their backs on God. The book of Judges tells us a generation arose that did not know what God had done. And now they start following the gods of the nations around them, including Moab. Now, right now I have to tell you something. I wish the Bible was did a little better job of censoring their story. You know where Moab came from? So Lot had 2 daughters who decided that they needed to carry on the family line. They had no children. So they consciously got their dad so dead drunk that he would not remember that he impregnated them. One the first night, one the second night. He wakes up in the morning, he didn't know anything happened. And the first son is named Moab. Second one is Ammon. Let's look at the map here for a minute. You can see the pink one down there is Moab. Most of the border between Judah, you can see Bethlehem there on the left side or the west side of the Dead Sea. Most of the border is the Dead Sea, but down at the bottom there's a tiny little land border where you could slip across. Now, when you crossed from one border to another back then, it was pretty simple. There were no boundaries that you would know about. You just walked until you said, I think I'm there. Like there's no sign telling you just crossed a national boundary. There's no wall. There's no barbed wire fence. There's no armed guards trying to make you stay in your own country. There was a much greater sense that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And if there's a famine in one place, oh yeah, there's that word famine. You just gloss over it when you read this first sentence. There was a famine in the land. People are starving. I've been to some places where there's no irrigation. If it doesn't rain for months on end, the crops just die, the land cracks. There is no refrigerator. There's no food for tomorrow. When they pray, give us this day our daily bread, or our daily rice and beans, or whatever it is, they're being literal because there is no food for tomorrow. And famines that sweep through in those settings are humanitarian disasters. We've been pretty well sheltered from that in our place, but there's hardly a day, if you look at the news on the internet or on the television, where you don't see massive migrations of people because of natural disasters, they could be called, humanitarian catastrophes. And now here's one more thing. The book of Judges implies that sometimes God used hardship to try to get his people's attention and get them turned back to him. So sometimes that was to be defeated in battle, to have an enemy take over, or even famines. So the land of Judah. Now, you want to hear the irony? You know what Bethlehem means? House of bread. The house of bread was empty. And so this family crosses the border. People will do whatever it takes to keep their children alive. So they moved to Moab that had a long history of conflict and tension. Like the Moabites had not helped the Israelites when they got out of Exodus, the Egyptian crossing. And there were other reasons why there were even rules or laws in the Old Testament about not intermarrying with the Moabites, even for 10 generations. So this was a big deal to go to Moab. Let's go to the next part of the text. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they'd lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. If things could get worse, they just got worse. Okay, so I'm sure there are some people in the room, there clearly were in the first service, who have been widowed. In fact, the statistics tell us that in America, 90% of married women will become widows at some point in their lives, and a few men will be widowers. In these times, it was not just that you lost your best friend. It was not just that there's nobody in the bed next to you and all the loneliness that happens when you lose a life partner. It's that, but it's also that for a woman, she wasn't going to be able to own property. She wasn't going to be able to support herself. The only thing she had left after her husband died was, at least she has 2 sons. And the sons had to marry Moabite women. Who else are they going to marry? Now, I'm going to tell you a little story from when I was a pastor at New Hope Church. Of those 33 African refugees, 22 were descendants of Tutsis. They're called the Banyamulenge from Democratic Republic of the Congo. The other 11 were from Burundi, and they were Hutus. Have you ever heard of those 2 groups? So here we are in one relatively small church with people who all have been spending their lives running from each other, and all of them have family members who have been killed by the other tribe. They've all been in refugee camps. So it was a tricky thing to make our way through this. And finally, I took one of the patriarch of the one family, a man named Prudence, yes, a man named Prudence, to visit the other family from Burundi. And they talked about their experiences in Africa, how much they actually have in common, much more than with the Americans around them. And at the end, they all stood in a circle and held hands and prayed for one another. And then I went out to the car with Prudence. He closed the car door and he said, "But my sons will never marry their daughters, and my daughters will never marry their sons." Like, there's a line we will not cross. So when it says casually that these 2 guys married Moabite women, here's part of the problem with that. In those days, they thought of deities as belonging to a particular region. So God was the God of the Israelites, and when you cross the border, you go over to Chemosh land, and these Moabite women worship this pagan god. And he demands child sacrifice. I mean, this is a really awful pagan god. So it's not an easy thing or a good thing, but what are you going to do? So they married these Moabite men. Now, these women. For 10 years, there are no babies. this is indelicate, but let me say, for each of those women, that was 120 months when they had the disappointing news that I'm not pregnant. So that's 240 months in the life of that family when they had to experience the lack of sons together as a tragedy. Now, I say sons, not just daughters. Naomi didn't need granddaughters in her own mind. She needed grandsons because this is full-on patriarchy, and we're going to talk about that in the next 3 weeks. But let me say there were provisions in the patriarchy to carry on a family name. There were things that young widows could do, but all of this was kind of complex and a little difficult, but it all depended on sons. So when I was at International Child Care Ministries, my first year there, we had some available donors, sponsors. So I gave one of the bishops in India the privilege of turning in 100 applications for pastors' children to be sponsored, because the pastors were being paid almost nothing, and sometimes the children couldn't go to school. So the pastors' children were going to go to school. I got the applications. It was 94 boys and 6 girls. And I said, who made that decision? And he said, 100 pastors each decided for one. And every pastor who had a son turned in their son's application. And those 6 people that turned in a daughter just didn't have any sons. And I said to our national coordinator, what are we going to do about this? When is this going to change? He said, about 100 years. And I said, I'm not that patient. And he said, here's how we think. When you have a little girl, you feed her, you dress her. When she's 12 or 14, you're going to marry her off, and then she's going to serve her in-laws for the rest of her life. So any investment you make in her is leaving you when she's a teenager. On the other hand, if you invest in your son's education, he may get a good job and take care of you in your old age. He may be able to attract a wonderful woman to be his wife who will then serve you in your old age. Why would you not invest in your sons? Okay, so cultural things are very wrapped up into Bible stories, and we'll try to do some unpacking of that. But Naomi was at this point at the bottom of the story. Now just notice here that in the first 5 verses, all 3 men who have been introduced exit stage left. I mean, they die. So the women themselves could probably think this is the end of the story. Now, you think Ruth's a short book with 4 chapters, but try 5 verses, because there's no more story to be told after the 3 men all die. It's the exception that proves the rule that we go on to tell the story from the point of view of the women. And it's a pretty powerful story. Let's keep reading. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. Notice the words of blessing in this book. If you do actually read it on paper, underline every time you see a character expressing a blessing to another. Or if you're reading it online, highlight it. There are blessings, and she's blessing them, and she's just telling them to do the reasonable thing. Go back home. There's nothing for you in Judah. Because the deal is that if she goes back to the people of God, if Ruth or Orpah goes there, it's very, very limited who they could marry. It would have to be a relative of their dead husband. If they stay home in Moab, it's just a sad chapter that ended, and maybe they've got some hope for a future. There are parting words of blessing, and she says, go back to your mother's home. It's very interesting that she says your mother's home, because as I'm going to show in the next 3 weeks, the father's house is the central structure of the whole patriarchy that God had provided for people. It's the father's house. But she says, go back to your mother's home. I don't know for sure. Maybe their dads had already died. We don't know that. Now let's move on to the next verses. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, we will go back with you to your people. But Naomi said, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grow up? Do the math, folks. Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it's more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. There are 3 widows weeping here. Out there near the border, you can just hear their wailing and their sobbing. They love one another and they're parting. At first, they both intended to go with her. It's funny that it says, we'll go back with you, because they've never been there. But it's not logical for them to go. So sometimes we think that Orpah was not a good person because she turned around and went back home. But actually, she just was obeying her mother-in-law and doing the reasonable thing. Her name, Orpah, means nape. Like the nape of your neck, that's the last thing Naomi saw of Orpah. She turned around and left. The story continues. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. Hebrew scholars say that phrase actually says, may the Lord do this to me. There's a gesture in there that doesn't quite translate into English. May the Lord do this to me if anything but death, even death, separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. When I was young, this song used to be sung at weddings. Whither thou goest, remember that one? And when I found out it's actually a daughter-in-law pledging lifelong loyalty and fidelity to her mother-in-law, I mean, that's a head trip. It does not fit all of the mother-in-law, daughter-in-law stereotypes, does it? But she's now going to give to this mother-in-law in her old age companionship and the ability to do whatever work a woman can do. She's going to provide for her. She's going to be a means of grace. And so Naomi figures this woman is stubborn. She's not going back. So I'm going to go, and I'm going to take her with me. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Her name means pleasant. Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, which means bitter, because the Lord Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Now we have a chance to hear an iconic sufferer in the Bible struggle theologically. You know, we have Job, and the truth is that Naomi can be compared, and by some Hebrew scholars is compared to Job. This is a person whose suffering was immense. In fact, I read a book that said that actually Naomi out-Job Job because he was already rich to start with. He still had his wife, although that was a mixed blessing because she said, curse God and die. He had the ability to have more children, and his wealth was restored. So she started out so much lower on the totem pole, right? She was a woman. She was a widow. She was not going to have any of those future benefits. But their theological wrestling with God is exactly what we need to hear in both cases. Let's go to the next slide. The ultimate question of the book of Ruth, as with all Bible stories, is, what do we believe about God? Let's look at Naomi's accusations. 4 of them. She accuses God at this lowest point in her journey, when everything that could go wrong has gone wrong and more. The Almighty has made my life very bitter. Okay, God did this. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Now, if I were Ruth, I would say, what am I, chopped liver? I'm with you. But there is a sense that all my hopes and dreams are just done. I'm coming back home with nothing. And then she said, the Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So my question is, when our thoughts are a little bit distorted by our emotions that have taken a beating, is it okay for us to express, even if it's a bit distorted and half-baked, and we might come through the other end singing about the goodness of God, is it okay for believers to admit that in this moment I really can't sing about the goodness of God? In this moment, I'm brokenhearted. My life just took a whole different turn off to the left. I was not prepared for this. And you know, some of you, I know, have experienced this. Businesses have downsized, and you say, have I passed my expiration date? And you've experienced barrenness or infertility. Interesting that in the Bible, we never hear of a barren man. It's always expected that it's the woman who can't conceive. I'm going to give you a little spoiler alert. As soon as she gets together with Boaz, guess who gets pregnant? So I'm not sure it was her problem. I got ahead of myself, didn't I? Is it okay to express our confused state of frustration and lostness and maybe even accusation at God? Let's look at Job for a moment. He says many, many things, chapters and chapters worth, but listen to this one. I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me. You turn on me ruthlessly. With the might of your hand, you attack me. You snatch me up and drive me before the wind. You toss me about before the storm. I know you will bring me down to death, to the place appointed for all the living. Now, that's not the part of Job we remember very much, is it? I know that my Redeemer lives. That's the part we love, but we have a long way to get there. And the whole thing is in the Bible on purpose. I'm going to point you out to Jewish philosopher Elie Wiesel. After the Holocaust, he said this: never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to dust. Never shall I forget these things, even if I'm condemned to live as long as God himself. Never. And then, for all of you who have seen Les Mis, when I pastored for 10 years at New Hope, I became a meme because everybody was predicting, could I get through a sermon without referring to Les Mis? Usually Jean Valjean. This time it's Fantine. She sings, I dreamed a dream in time gone by, when hope was high and life worth living. I dreamed that love would never die. I prayed that God would be forgiving. And the last line is, now life has killed the dream I dreamed. Sometimes the arts will help us to get in touch with realities and feelings that we'd rather just sweep under the rug. Sometimes when we see someone else's pain, we can acknowledge our own. So we all go through the depths. And most of us ask, where is God? For some of you, it's a cancer diagnosis. For some of you, it's a friendship that turned into betrayal. For some of you, it's a wayward child or a relationship gone sour. When we hit the depths, most of us want to know, where is God? And so in our pain, we often miss the grace that God is providing. In your pain, look for God's means of grace. I can tell you that Ruth became an amazing means of grace for Naomi. Sometimes God comforts us just by the ministry of His Holy Spirit in our broken hearts. Sometimes He brings somebody alongside. That's one thing churches are supposed to do, and rooted groups are supposed to do, is to actually be there for one another when life hurts. God is there. Sometimes it helps to be able to look into somebody's eyes who represents Jesus to you in your deepest pain. So we're going to sing a song, and I'll just say that I know this altar is open. I've watched you quite a few times online over the last 3 years, and I see that the Spirit has a special way of meeting you in the posture of kneeling, sometimes with 2 or 3 others who know your story well, to seek the Lord together right here, right now, in the midst of your pain.